Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ren Troy Brown, and I am the founder and producer of the Ebony Repertory Theater, and we are the resident company and operator of the Nate Holgen Performing Arts Center. We are honored, indeed, we count it a privilege to be here with all of you today at the Bunche Center, and so we thank everyone here at the Bunche Center, particularly Dr. Hunt and my beloved Alex, and everyone here at the staff for welcoming us here to the campus of UCLA, here at the Bunche Center. As a fourth-generation Angelino, it brings me great joy to be associated with Dr. Bunche et al. As one of our great native sons and one of the great sons of UCLA. But we're honored that we've been welcomed along with Dr. Henry Miller. Dr. Henry Miller is the author of Theorizing Black Theatre, Art versus Protest and Critical Writings from 1898 to 1965. As a means of background, I'd like to share a bit about Dr. Miller. Dr. Henry Miller's book, Theorizing Black Theatre, Art versus Protest and Critical Writings, 1898 to 1965, is his latest literary work. His collection of one-act plays, Songs of One-Act Muse, and his full-length play, My Brother's Keeper, have been published by the Alexander Street Press and made available on CD-ROM as a part of the Black Drama Anthology. Dr. Miller is a veteran of the 1960s and 1970s Black theater movement. A director and playwright, he has written broadly about the American theater. The rich history of African American theater has been overlooked, both in the theoretical discourse and in practice. This volume seeks a critical engagement with Black theater artists and theorists of the 20th century. It reveals a comprehensive view of the art or propaganda debate that dominated 20th century African American dramatic theory. Among others, this text addresses the writings of Langston Hughes, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, Lorraine Hansberry, Amiri Baraka, Sidney Poitier, and August Wilson. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, we're so pleased with Ebony Repertory Theater and the Bunche Center to present Dr. Henry D. Miller. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome.
Thank you, Ren, and I'm going to try to make this quick. I like to deal with questions from my audience because I do that a lot better, I think, sometimes. But I'm going to start right away and get right into it. I've tried to present this, make up a little PowerPoint to make this a little more interesting, or at least visually a little more interesting. And I have to do some clicking, and my coordination is not that great, so you'll stick with me if I have a problem. I guess my overarching theme with this book was really to go back to the future to come up with a new aesthetic of theater, an aesthetic of Black theater. And I kind of realized that after I finished the book. As often happens, even when you're writing plays, you understand what you've written after you've written it. So let me just go straight ahead with that. So it's Back to the Future in search of a new Black theater aesthetic, and one of the first things that we have to deal with, and in my introduction to you of the book, is something that I call post-slavery classicism, which roughly is 1865 to 1900. And an introduction to the prevailing ideas about the drama in progressive 19th century Negro America is necessary to any meaningful discussion of 20th century African American dramatic theory. 19th century notions of the nature and proper uses of Black drama in Negro America were in the main the product of the educational backgrounds of a group of thinkers and practitioners who laid the early foundations of 20th century Black dramatic theory. In theater in historically Black colleges, a survey of 100 years, James V. Hatch writes that with the ink of capitulation hardly dry at Appomattox, the Protestants American Missionary Association flew into the conquered South, and they built denominational schools for the newly freed slaves. So to introduce their future teachers and ministers to the rhetorical beauties of what was then called the art of declamation, the missionary schools required the study of Shakespeare, the Bible, the Greeks, the usual Roman orators. So thus, I guess it's important to understand that in Negro America, following the Civil War, excuse me, a kind of post-slavery American classicism became central to the education of what William Easton, in his preface to his 1893 play Dessalines, called a new emancipation illiterati. The missionary schools, or schools very much like them, educated the members of the new emancipation literati, who were to have the greatest influence on African American dramatic theory. W.E.B. Du Bois, and I see his picture right behind you over there, Elaine Locke, Will Marion Cook, James Weldon Johnson, Robert A. Cole, and Archibald Grimke were 6 of Easton's emancipation literati. And with Cole and Cook, they were the practitioners in the theater, and I hope there are going to be some questions about them. The educational career of the biologist, and you may recall him because he was on the postal stamps for a minute, of the biologist Ernest Just. Now, he was the founder of the first Howard Players at the Howard University. A lot of people don't know, they know he was a biologist. And his life and what he did is perhaps one of the better illustrations of what I call post-slavery classicism. Just attended the denominational school, the missionary school, Kimball Union Academy in New Hampshire in 1899. And then at Kimball, he pursued a classical course of study, so he ended up a biologist. But at Kimball, he pursued a classical course of study in preparation for a career as a Greek scholar of antiquity. That's what Just originally wanted to be, and he would have never been on the stamp, I guess, if he did that. But anyway, Kimball early on saw the importance of theater as an educational tool, and there Just performed in Goldsmith's 18th century comedy, She Stoops to Conquer. Just continued his classical education, classical studies, until in his 3rd semester at Dartmouth in 1904, he changed his major course of study to the sciences. And Just is very important, especially for us African American scholars, for another reason. He is the father of Margaret Just Butcher. And Margaret Just Butcher, major scholar, was also Elaine Locke's first biographer. So the post-slavery classicism of the schools that Just and Du Bois, Johnson, and the others attended was what I call an American synthesis of the classical and the romantic. In the preface to Dessalines, back to Easton for a minute, Easton exemplified this American mixture of the classical and the romantic. He's setting forth a combination of Horatian and neoclassical Aristotelian view of the cathartic purposes of the drama, and revealing, of course, the value he accorded Shakespeare's drama. So this is the romantic and the classical together. This is what we got in America. And this kind of Shakespeare's drama really formed much of the inspirational foundation of German Romanticism. Easton wrote, and in quotes, "In ancient Rome, the drama was made the reformer of private vices and public morals." And this is really a Horatian idea. "The stage in those days, as it is today, was a mirror for despots to view their own iniquity," close quotes. And then humorously, Easton continues, "Othello, once the pride," this always makes me laugh, "Othello, once the pride of the ambitious colored histrionic, has sadly metamorphosed his once singularly dark complexion, and now holds the boards the victim of a very mild suntan." I find this very interesting because this is in 1893 that wasn't white people playing Othello, but black people playing Othello, until they got to this very mild tan. The romantic American classicism of Shakespeare had taken hold in large segments of progressive Negro America long before the onset of the Civil War. We have as evidence for this phenomenon the work of the African-American Shakespearean actor James Hewlett, right, at the Black African Grove Theatre in New York City in the 1820s, and the subsequent career of Ira Aldridge, who was an early member of the African Grove. I think he was a 15-year-old kid running around doing things in the theater in the African Grove in the 1820s. But then, of course, Ira Aldridge had this subsequent career and was and became a Shakespearean actor who achieved really tremendous international notice in the 1850s. I always, just as a little aside, since we have a little time and kind of close audience here, I have a problem with black people now who run to play Shakespeare, even some of our famous ones, because this was done in the 1850s, and I don't think we need to prove any longer that we can do iambic pentameter and trochee. So, just let me read this, because this is Hewlett as Richard in Richard III in New York City at the Grove Theatre, and then Ira Aldridge. This is probably from Britain. Aldridge as an early, we have pictures of later portrayals, but apparently he's probably a little bit too young for Othello here, but as an early portrayal of Shakespeare's Othello, probably in England. Let's move on. W.E.B. Du Bois, in his prelude to The Star of Ethiopia, which was a pageant, used what many Americans of his generation would have termed, but for the race of his dramatic figures, the classical imagery and tone of the royal entries and pageants of medieval and early Renaissance Europe. Du Bois wrote, and I sort of hear him intoning, the lights of the court of freedom blaze, and a trumpet blast is heard, and 4 heralds, black and of gigantic stature, appear with silver trumpets, standing at the 4 corners of the Temple of Beauty. Sounds like Du Bois to me. Close quotes. Du Bois privileged the element of beauty in art, or rather the elements of truth and beauty in art, and this is in the Romantic tradition of Keats. The 19th century reverberation of post-slavery classicism of the missionary schools and their non-denominational counterparts, this continued well into the 20th century, folks. On 20 April 1915, in the pages of the New York Age, James Weldon Johnson extolled the virtues of Shakespeare's words, using as his examples passages from Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet, Henry V. During the Harlem Renaissance, Alain Locke, one of our post-slavery classicism people, Alain Locke, in The Drama of Negro Life, calls on plays which would be, in some senses, modeled after classical drama. Locke wrote, "The situation of race holds tragedies and ironies as deep and keen as those of the ancient classics." In this same essay, Locke reveals a telling sliver of his Aristotelian training. He was, after all, a philosopher. Aristotelian training in his criticism of Willard Richardson's play, The Chip Woman's Fortune. Locke wrote that the play needed more of the emotional depth of pity and terror, which is straight out of Poetics, Aristotle's Poetics. Now, 12 years later, during the Great Depression, the poet-dramatist Owen Dodson seemed to follow Locke's earlier suggestion in his Divine Comedy, a drama replete with the classical techniques of allegory, verse adaptations, and adaptations of the Greek chorus. Excuse me. In this work, classically based aesthetic strategies were used in an attempt to lift the Depression-inspired troubles of ordinary Negroes to the Aristotelian cathartic heights of the pity and terror with which Locke was concerned. This is 1938 and the Depression. Dodson's case is perhaps a special one in that it provides a clear insight to the elements of what we started with the post-slavery classicism from the 19th century to the 20th. Hatch writes, this James V. Hatch writes that Dodson was born, you're going to be interested in this, Hatch writes that Dodson was the son of parents born 5 years after the end of the Civil War, and that they provided Dodson a Brooklyn, New York home in which a Baptist devotion to the Bible embodied a reference for literacy. So Dodson's mother had been a Virginia teacher, a Virginia school teacher. His father had graduated from Virginia's Wayland Seminary, which rigorously imposed upon its Negroes oratory, the Bible's study, ethics, as well as Latin and Greek. Wayland, as might be expected, was subsidized by Northern missionaries. So Dodson's parents were full-fledged members of Easton's new emancipation literati. The aesthetic values of those literati had been, so to speak, imbibed by Dodson with his mother's milk. As a graduate of Yale Drama School, we have a student from Yale Drama School at ERT. As a graduate of Yale Drama School 1938, a stage director, and a professor of drama at Howard University for 25 years, Dodson's life and work influenced the work of African American theater thinkers and practitioners of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Hatch reports that Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, Frank Silvera, Ted Shine, Gordon Heath, Richard Wesley are but a few of the black theater people with whom Dodson shared his vast knowledge of the traditional theater. Dodson's 1968 essay, Playwrights in Dark Glasses, uses, among others, Shakespeare and Aristophanes as models for African American drama and advances the classically based aesthetics of universality and inevitability as necessary elements of important African American drama. So the missionary schools and the missionary and other schools with classically oriented curricula helped to create this thing I call post-slavery classicism, of which Dodson and others were direct descendants. When evaluating the progress of African American contemporary scholarship, contemporary scholarship considers the classical elements of universality, inevitability, and humanism, that these elements, they occurred on the African continent in the world's oldest drama, the ancient Egypt's Abydos Passion Play. And just let me get to that. This is ancient Egypt's Abydos Passion Play. And this occurred more than a millennia, important point, I'm going to say it again, more than a millennia before these classical ideas, excuse me, let me get rid of that. It won't go, will it? More than a millennia before these classical ideas and elements dominated 5th and 6th century Greek drama. Have to let that set in. Now this is a slide when my wife was sitting back there when we visited Egypt, 1992, or yeah, I think that's when it was. This is the Abydos. This is a slide from the Abydos Passion Play. It's 1868 BC. It is a bas relief in a temple in the holy precincts of Abydos in Egypt. Okay, which is on the African continent and not in some place called the Middle East that white folks made up. Okay, and I hope there will be more questions about this. But the issue of universality, inevitability, and humanism, there's Horus to the far left. There is Osiris lying what we call ithiphallic. You're going to ask me a question about that. And you can see Isis over to the right a bit. And this is the beginning of the whole Every Dose Passion play. So I'm going to move on, and you're going to talk about that, I hope. So further, then we have this thing about, well, Egypt's not really, well, not really Africans, or maybe, but we have this thing about Black Africa. Somebody, Diop, the great African historian, said, well, we have Black Africa, but we don't have Brown Europe. It's really strange. Okay, so I have to put in further from John Mabede's Religion and Philosophies. Mabede writes, I keep hitting this thing, sorry. Mabede, for his book, African Religions and Philosophies, it can be seen too that the so-called classical elements of universality, humanized gods, hold sway in virtually all the rest of traditional Africa as well. So we're not going to say Black Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. All of this means that post-slavery classicism, and I think this is a particularly important point, all of this means that post-slavery classicism was not wholly a matter of the newly freed slaves assimilating the imposed classical Eurocentric dogma of their white Protestant teachers. The freedmen, still at least in part a culturally African people, undoubtedly experience a general, if unspecified, affinity with the philosophical assumptions of humanism and universality. It was part of their culture for thousands of years. We have to understand that, because the people in my generation decided to come out with Afrocentric, and that has nothing to do with us, and we invented it. So they had some kind of sympathy with these what was underlying their classical training from these Protestant schools. So similarly, and if we think that's a long time ago, because I know we're in America and we go by the 24-hour news cycle. Similarly, in our own time, so maybe we can remember him, this gentleman. Similarly, in our own time, we must consider, too, that August Wilson's seemingly Aristotelian-inspired remarks that the common, and quote, the common values of the American theater that we share, mainstream and Black drama, are plot, dialogue, characterization, and design. His remarks may not be merely the result of Wilson's assimilation of the European well-made play. Rather, this remark may well be from a traditional African-American contemporary result, an African-American contemporary result of a fundamental African philosophical assumptions about the humanist and universal nature of the cosmos, and therefore about the nature of dramatic art. So this is August Wilson, and we're told he's our most important playwright, so maybe we ought to just think about that a little bit more. Is Wilson's position taken from the European well-made play? This is what a lot of folks have said. Or from an African and traditional Black American belief in a universal and humanist cosmos. And I always go back to the civil rights movement for, as far as Black Americans, in our belief in a universal cosmos and universal equality. But this is an African thing. So maybe August Wilson, as critics, is not just copying the white folks. Let me go on. I think my time is getting rather short. At the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, this gentleman that I see you have back there, Booker T. Washington was, in quotes, the one recognized spokesman of his 10 million fellows, which, as W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, and by the turn of the century, it was Washington's self-help program of industrial education and conciliation of the South that dominated progressive Negro thought. Okay. Washington, and a lot of people don't know this, had, however, an avid interest in theatrical movie making. That's why I put self-help and movie making. Now, maybe he had this because perhaps the mastery of early film's technology required something akin to what could be called industrial training he advocated, right? Anybody who's worked in film, I happen to have done so, and studied it, that it is connected to that. Washington's death, and this is another one of the great tragedies of African American history, Washington's death in 1915 may have changed the course of African American film history. He died just before his personal secretary, Emmett Scott, signed an agreement with the Advanced Motion Picture Company of Chicago to have Washington's Tuskegee Institute to have Washington's Tuskegee Institute and the National Negro Business League co-produce a cinematic answer to D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. Without Washington's leadership, Scott eventually lost control of the project. Can you imagine what would have happened if this was done in 1915? Anyway, let's move on. The post-slavery classicism that led a growing number of Negro intellectuals to see drama as a necessary avenue of Negro expression had apparently held little interest for Washington. So the effects of post-slavery classicism did not take hold in Negro intellectual life until after Washington's death, and its seeds did not fully flower until the period known as the Harlem Renaissance, which this young man thought I was born in. 1919 to 1929. In the broad field of American theater studies, there's almost an alarming paucity of books relating to black dramatic theory. We kind of don't deal with that with us black folks. The model studies for my book are Samuel Hayes' African American Theater and an Historical and Critical Analysis, and Marvin Carlson's Theories of the Theater, a historical and critical survey from the Greeks to the present. In terms of methodology, Theorizing Black Theatre is heavily indebted to Carlson's historical and critical surveys of existing theories of the theater and the discourse between theorists and theater thinkers. Hay, perhaps for the first time in a scholarly book, takes up the art or propaganda debate first formulated in Elaine Locke's article, Art or Propaganda, published in the periodical Harlem in 1928. I have to say that because people act like Hay invented this, but actually there was an article by Locke in 1928, and that's where Hayes' idea came from. And also, Hay, in identifying its primary, in his book, he identifies the primary combatants for this art or propaganda issue as Du Bois and Elaine Locke. So Hayes' work offers a broad, if limited, view of 20th century black dramatic theory. A third of Hayes' book is devoted to non-theoretical issues, such as theater development, governance, and a proposed national endowment of African American theater. So excluding these non-theoretical concerns, Theorizing Black Theatre attempts to offer a more comprehensive view of 20th century black dramatic theory than now exists. Who's in and who's out? By way of introduction, I need to let you know who may be in and who's out of this book. In keeping with the discourse between theorists found in Carlson's Theories of the Theater, for most of the periods of African American theater covered in this book, there are but two pertinent figures who can reasonably be described as theorists. The seminal sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois and, like Aristotle, the philosopher Alain Leroy Locke. Yet neither Locke, Du Bois, nor any other historical figure in African American arts and letters until Amiri Baraka in the 1960s would have described themselves as theater theorists. Nevertheless, the historical record shows that Du Bois and Locke each had a pervasive and singular influence on Negro arts at a time when formative and enduring questions about those arts, including the drama, were first being posed. In addition to participating in the Negro theater arts since 1913, a lot of people don't know that about Du Bois, and almost single-handedly invoking the arts and letters credo of the Harlem Renaissance, Du Bois was also the editor of the Crisis magazine, the NACP organ that was from its founding in 1909 to the 1930s, the most widely read publication in Negro America. Thus, Du Bois's views on politics and arts were widely absorbed by a mostly grateful national Negro public. Similarly, it is seldom remembered that in addition to Alain Locke's efforts to encourage the establishment of a Negro art theater from about 1916 almost until his death in 1954, he was the first African American Rhodes Scholar, a status he held for some 40 years. And this fact alone gave him a formidable influence over the thinking of the Negro intelligentsia of his day. Du Bois and Locke were, in fact, the chief combatants in the art or propaganda debate that dominated African American drama for most of the 20th century. Therefore, for the purposes of this book, or my book, they are treated as the primary theorist of the 20th century black dramatic theory. Also, it's of paramount importance are the plays treated in this book. The overwhelming majority of them are produced works. In my experience as a practitioner of African American theater and my researches as a theater scholar, it is almost a rule of thumb that produced dramas, as compared to unproduced ones, have an overwhelming influence on the development of dramatic theory. None of the closet dramas written in the civil rights period of the late 1950s and the 60s affected the way we think about the nature of African American drama, as did Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, or Charles Gordon's Pulitzer Prize winning No Place to Be Somebody. Indeed, historically, Seneca's most notable closet tragedies have inspired a relatively tiny discourse on the development of dramatic theory, as compared to Shakespeare's plays, which I think I mentioned, form the foundation of the entire field of romantic theory. For these reasons, and the obvious fact that that not every play written by an African American in the first 65 years of the 20th century can reasonably be covered in one book, with a few exceptions, what is dealt with in this book are produced dramatic works. Two notable exceptions to this rule are the plays by an often unsung playwright. Okay, I did get that right. By an often unsung playwright of the earlier 20th century. This is Mary Burrill. Burrill's They That Sit in Darkness was written at a time when it was against the law to distribute birth control information to American women. And it is perhaps the first play, why do I keep doing that? And it is perhaps the first play And it's definitely the first extant African-American drama to take up this issue then as now. Okay, this is a difficult issue. We're going through this in the politics right now. But this is the picture, I think, of the suffragists, I don't call them suffragettes, suffragists outside of the White House. And of course they had a fight for liberty, but that included the fight for reproductive rights. So that's Burrell's, one of Burrell's plays, and we go to the another one. Burrell's Aftermath seriously foreshadows the militant activist drama of the Black arts movement of the 1960s, when her central character, a black soldier returning home from World War I, leaves his home gun in hand to avenge the lynching of his father while he was busy fighting for freedom abroad. Okay, so here it is. This is the famous slide that I can't stop using, but it's the black troops marching up Fifth Avenue in New York. But as I say, or as you can read, black troops returning from World War I abroad to face the segregation wars at home. And that's what Burrell's play was about, foreshadowing all the militant stuff folks like me was doing in the 1960s, and not crediting her with it. Anyway, so although there appears to be no production record of these plays, and I couldn't find one, I have included treatments of them in the book as evidence of the diversity and militancy of African-American protest drama. Finally, on this issue of what's in and what's out of this book, the omission here of one of the preeminent African-American novelists, Zora Neale Hurston, needs some explanation. In fact, Hurston's mostly unproduced 10 writings for the stage in the Library of Congress suggest a crying need for a title about her work, perhaps The Closet Dramas of Zora Neale Hurston. Of her known plays, Mulebone and Sermon in the Valley was repeatedly produced at Caramel House in Cleveland, and the Charles Gilpin plays in Cleveland repeatedly in the 1930s. But Mulebone was controversially, something we don't like to discuss, but Mulebone was controversially co-authored with Langston Hughes, and I have found no extant copies of Sermon in the Valley. Perhaps more importantly, the Mulebone controversy between Hurston and Hughes proved to be more than a battle over copyright ownership and Huston's alleged plagiarism of Hughes's work. It was perhaps the first sign of Hurston's growing estrangement from the leadership of the already waning Harlem Renaissance. Only Elaine Locke took her side in this controversy. The Mulebone controversy was also the beginning of the obscurity from which she would be posthumously retrieved by Alice Walker in 1973. Mulebone was revived on Broadway in 1991. But tragically, I think, in the field of black drama, Hurston's influence over the progress of black dramatic theory in the periods covered in this book is at best minimal, especially when compared to black women dramatists of produced plays like Angelina Grimke, who I hope you're going to ask about, in the early 20th century, or Eulalie Spence of the Harlem Renaissance. Of course, Alice Childress and Lorraine Hansberry in the 1950s. Given the 1970s revival of Hurston's literary achievements and the Broadway production of Mulebone in 1991, a critical examination of her work in the theater may prove to have a far greater influence on African-American drama of the 70s and beyond than it ever had on the historical periods treated in this book. Okay, folks, I'm trying to wrap this up. We may have a little time for questions. This book has been much more, this introduction rather, has been much more a primer for the way this book is written, its methodology, that it is a beginning glimpse of every significant issue and historical figure in almost a century of black dramatic theory. In its entirety, Theorizing Black Theatre is, in the words of McFarland's publisher, a book that reveals a comprehensive view of the art or propaganda debate that dominated 20th century black dramatic theory. Among many others, this text addresses the writings of Langston Hughes, W.E.B. Du Bois, Elaine Locke, Angelina Grimke, Lorraine Hansberry, Amiri Baraka, Adrian Kennedy, Alice Childress, Sidney Poitier, and August Wilson. Of particular note is the manner in which theory collides or intersects with the canonical theorists, including Aristotle, Keats, Ibsen, we said a little something about Keats, Nietzsche, Shaw, and O'Neill. Finally, its early reviewers found that the book is a milestone that ignites a spirited conversation, and I can't stop clicking that, a spirited conversation about how we think and feel about the theater, and gives us a whole new look at our country, and begins to undo the damage that segregation has done to our historical perspective. But right now, I'm finished, and I'm anxious to hear your remarks. Any comments? I hope.
Well, to start it off, the presentation was excellent, and it raised a number of questions that I want to address with you, not only as an author, but also as a playwright and as a producer. And Ren, feel free to chip in. The first thing is you pointed out Dobson I can relate to probably in more ways than just the Brooklyn reference.
Right.
Both of my parents are from Virginia as well.
Oh, okay, okay.
And certainly growing up, when we moved from Bed-Stuy to Virginia, getting started in the church. As Ren can probably tell you, some of our more illustrious African-American actors and singers started in the church. So when you make a reference with the Bible. Also, you made reference to another one of my personal heroes, Du Bois. You had to throw in Washington, I know, for balance sake. But when you look at the state of black or African-American theater right now, and coming from the real part of the country, the right coast, where theater is probably more, that was for you, Red, the theater is probably more rooted than out here on the left coast where you have more film.
Movies and television. Yeah.
Exactly. Not even TV as much as it used to be in New York. Kind of migrated out here.
Yeah.
Organizations like the NAACP obviously have the ACT-SO program, in which they focus on dramatic interpretation, playwriting, etc. What can we do in this day and age here at a university that is not one of the historical black colleges to focus more on not only the historical aspect of black theater, but also repopulating it, where you just don't do a play in high school or junior high like I did, and automatically people think after that, oh, let me go do American Idol, or let me go into the film industry. How can we have more faces that we see that aren't traditional film and TV people, maybe be nominated at the Tonys? I'd be curious.
Ooh, you got a lot of time. That's a big question. It sounds like Ren should answer. Yeah, right. It's,
you're dealing with practicality. I mean, in New York, that's what you focus more on theater. But as you start to leave in concentric circles throughout the rest of the country, it's more film, television, and now more of a variety kind of the American Idol.
I just think that, one of the things, and I think this is maybe more of an area for Ren to answer, but from my point of view and what I do and what my life is about, the first thing we need to understand about the theater is that it's always been a narrow thing. So, because a lot of times, I'm a person out of the 60s, obviously, you can see from these gray hairs, but we brought a certain kind of idea out that you're going to get everybody to participate. It's a whole political engine, which perhaps was maybe right for that moment. But in fact, the theater is a tiny thing. The theater is not a huge thing. So I think we need to first think about it in that sense, and not feel like we're failures because we haven't organized, with the 500 square miles of Los Angeles and got all the black people to be involved in some way in the theater. My thing is obviously about education. If you're a professor and you teach in school, it's about education. So it's to deal with that, it's to deal with it in that way. And then from the practical point, I think it really is about the quality of the work. If you have the quality of the work is going to attract the people that you need. I really feel, and somebody told me, a friend of mine, I'm too big at putting down my own generation, but we concentrated too much on the goddamn politics. What about the work? And then a certain audience that we kind of ignored, from the point of view of the work, there is an audience, at least I can speak for New York. Ren was born here, so he'll tell you about this situation. But in New York, we had an audience of working class, middle class people, police officers, teachers, firemen, black. This is a huge group of people who actually could afford to buy a theater ticket. But we really weren't writing plays. We got mad. We said, well, y'all black folks don't support the theater. We said all of that. That was, it may be partially true, but the other side of that is the stuff that we were writing, which was largely protest stuff to get whitey straight or to get this, I call this mythical group of black people who didn't know anything about racism, to tell them about racism. That's what we were doing. So we were not marketing to people who could actually pay for a theater ticket. We weren't writing stuff for that. A lot of my work is about that. If anybody's able to get to our symposium, we're going to be doing some scenes and stuff from that work. You'll see from my work, and you'll see that it's about that. Okay? Because that's what I write about, that's my life, that's what I'm into, but that's also the audience. We're not actually going to get people up off the curb and they're going to all run into the theater. We kind of thought that was a very strong political thing, which actually, when you study the history, goes back to the 1930s, and it goes, at least in New York, I'm not going to attack you out here, but it goes back to the white left. This notion. Baraka, at a point in his comments in the 80s, he begins to say a lot of stuff. I was in college and we had all these left-wing people, white professors and stuff, and a lot of it goes back to that. So I think if you kind of do, from the aesthetic point, if you do your stuff, you're going to build an audience. I'm going to shut up in 1 minute and let Ren get into this. But you're going to build an audience. And just one more thing. I have a friend in San Diego, and I told her I was coming out here to do this, and I told Ren about this, and I, typed her an email and blah, 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 so forth. She goes, oh, ERT, that's a wonderful, she's in San Diego, that's not next door, right? See what I'm saying? So that's what I think, aesthetically, what you have to do. Now, the politics of it and which mayor you got to elect, and Ren will tell you about that.
Well, Alex, and to all of you, finally, it's about what we place a premium on. And the theater, like this country, has been profoundly segregated throughout its history. Very, very balkanized. The theater and culture, particularly what we would call Broadway, that was for dominant culture, people, period. We had the TOBA, Theater Owners Booking Association, which was a vaudeville tour. It was not the Orpheum Keith Circuit, which was owned by Joseph Kennedy. but the TOBA was Tough on Black Acts, Theater Owners Booking Association. It was a secondary black tour, very, very segregated. And the only reason we see any presence, in my feeling, of any numbers of black people on Broadway presently, it's purely about commerce. It's purely about commerce. We see now A Streetcar Named Desire is coming in blackface because Cat on a Hot Tin Roof in blackface made Broadway producers a lot of money. Versus producing the black playwright, you know, like Alani Elder's Ceremonies and Dark Old Men, or any of the other great black playwrights we have. We are sending our greatest black celebrities and stars to do the work of white writers, which was not intended for our community. So again, it becomes an outing for black people to participate in the celebrity of people they see on film and television, but not going there with an organic, deep feeling about wanting to be a real theater patron, wanting to be a subscriber, wanting to see themselves as whole. And that's one of the things like Dodson and the Howard Players after Locke. Dodson was a classicist. I think he was out of Bates College early on.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And he did Ibsen, and he did things like that, and really placed the value on those writers as he taught those black students. So they never got a chance to really act their own voice. They never got a chance to really do the work of people who knew them as well. So these are things that are very, very difficult. And the work out here, film and television does dominate here. But again, it's really tragic that in 2007, I, along with Israel Hicks, the late Israel Hicks, could form the first and only African-American professional theater in the city of Los Angeles. Now, Actors Equity has been around since 1913, and you could come to 2007 before the first professional African-American theater is created in this city. I'm very proud that we created the Ebony Repertory Theater, but I'm not proud of the distinction of that first. Because finally, we cannot survive if we're not paid a living wage. And we cannot survive with any sense of self without seeing ourselves as whole. So we need to see ourselves, we need to hear ourselves. And so that's the plight all over this country. You know, Doc, if I may, yes, please.
I was just going to say about, you know, seeing more black people get Tonys. There's a whole community of black actors that are auditioning every day, right now, seeking those roles. And the roles just aren't there unless, you know, there's a new kind of revival with The Color Purple and some of the August Wilson revivals that have successfully done well on Broadway. But these producers are like, aha, we can make money. Even the influence of Tyler Perry, I think, is kind of people thinking about the commerce potential. But just as someone who, a practitioner and scholar, I have friends that are, you know, beating the concrete, auditioning for whatever's open, white roles, black roles, Asian roles. They're just trying to get a role in New York. And then, because it's about more and more about commerce, when the black roles open up, they're more prone to choose celebrities now, as opposed to the person who does have a degree in theater, who does, you know, who is a triple threat, who can do everything from Shakespeare to musical theater, who's genuinely talented, like some of my friends are. I mean, I've got talent too, but I'm more, but I mean, people who dedicated their lives to the process and seeing these roles. So I'm just saying amen.
Well, thank you. But you know, to your point, and we're so glad that you're doing the work that you're doing, but particularly in New York City, people are under the misapprehension that when they get on a train and they see all the diversity of New York on a train, you, after 6 o'clock, go to the Upper East Side and see whether or not people are breaking bread together and whether people are really coming to know one another, you know, in real ways. And that's the thing about it. A city like this, we get in our cars and we, again, are very, very segregated because of that. And so there's not really a real integration. And the dominant culture has always placed a premium on all that it does.
And also, I think it's worth noting that the narrow, I'm glad you brought that point up, the narrow space for theater, it's not just a narrow space for theater in terms of blackness, but even in, you know, for white America, theater is still kind of an elite institution. It's not something that people in middle America are just flocking to, you know, it's not a part of everybody's everyday life. And just if we think of everybody you know, and if we were to poll our our friends and families and cousins, black or white, and do the same, do kind of a study on different sides of the nation. When was the last time you went to a live theater production? And we're in the academy, so we have, at UCLA, we have access, to so much richness, right, physically here. But the average person isn't going to shows.
Yeah, this is a thing of education, and we're not all that much in it. We're not in the theater that much in America, and we're certainly not that much in education. Not for the kind of economic power that we represent in the world, but the important thing for people like yourself and the people that I'm trying to reach out to is to understand the nature of it. I had a professor in a doctoral program. He said the city of Vienna gives more money to the Vienna Opera than all of the National Endowment gives to the United States, to arts, okay?
Wow.
And Austria is an 8th-rate economy or a 10th-rate compared to the United States. And what I fear is a lot of times we talk about the other and the man and all of this other stuff, and we don't understand, these people don't care anything about this. But one of the things about Broadway, I think I was saying the other day, Christopher Durang is probably considered one of the top 10 or 20 playwrights in the United States. They have been trying to get him to Broadway for 20 years. He won't go because he's trying to do serious work. He's not interested. Because if you go to Broadway, I don't care if you're black, white, polka dot, whatever, we're paying rent in New York. That's what we're doing. That's the first thing we do. Now we worry about the arts. First we have to pay this rent. So this is what that is about, and I think is important for a lot of the... Ren was saying, we have people that held Broadway as an icon, and it's very strange to me. When Langston Hughes, before Raisin, we talk about Raisin, and we talk about, but Langston Hughes went to Broadway in 1935, okay, with a play called Mulatto. But they took his play, his mother was dying of cancer, so he couldn't fight it or argue it because he needed the money, and they put a rape scene in Mulatto. That's Broadway, okay? So people do not have wonderful experiences. Raisin that you just did, an act was taken out of Raisin for Broadway. Okay? Black people don't have wonderful experiences, those who go. So we need to, I don't want another generation with that icon. What you do with Broadway is when the man comes to you and say, I want your stuff, and he's got this check with all those zeros on it, you say, okay, I'm coming, and then you get the money, you go back home and give it to your mama and your little theater company and blah, blah, blah. That's what you do with Broadway. It's not an icon of anything.
So maybe not now, but I'd be interested in hearing about your take on Porgy and Bess right now, the revival that I think was in Chicago, and now they're prepping to go to Broadway.
Well, yeah, okay. Gershwin with Porgy. They retired.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Porgy was a play.
Yes.
And a book before that. A book before that. Yeah.
And Mr. Gershwin auditioned one of the great first black singers and graduates Anne Brown.
Anne Brown, okay.
Anne Brown was a student at Juilliard, who she was the first best, and she went to audition for Mr. Gershwin at the Juilliard School of Music when it was only a school of music, and she impacted him in such a way that he put Bess as a part of his title. Mm-hmm. And she just died literally, I think, at 98 in Copenhagen, or in Norway, I think it was, just about 4 years ago. Anne Brown, and Todd Duncan was the original.
Todd Duncan, right, that's it. Yeah, I did. Porgy and Bess directed it for the Indianapolis Opera. This is a decade now. Time goes very fast. And for the Philadelphia Opera. So it's very, very close to me. So I tell you that up front because maybe I have a jaundiced view. People need to announce their perhaps prejudices. But Porgy and Bess, I just have to give this little background. Porgy and Bess was, I'm thinking of writing a book called The Opera That Black People Love to Hate. Okay, because that's what Porgy and Bess was. But it was, and it was for me too. But it was always this very strange thing. My dad was a jazz aficionado, right? This is what I grew up, and he had a little music room in our South Bronx apartment, and just his great uncle, painted on the wall. Lester Young painted on the wall. I can still see. He said, Henry, you know, really look at this. I said, come on, I like the music Arthur. I said what black people have always said. But then I dealt with it, because Arthur, I had deep respect for him as a performing artist, and he's just a wonderful singer. And we had done another opera with a black company called Opera Ebony before that. So, you know, we had a relationship. So I said, well, the brothers begged me to look at this, I'm going to look at this. Porgy and Bess, so I did it. I read the play, the book, the whole deal, right? And I went through, when they finally decided to hire me, I think I prepared this show for, must have been close to a year. I had to do it basically on email, thank God for email, because all of this, you know, we were all separated. Indiana and Philadelphia, and these were the producers. Well, now here I am in the Bronx. Okay. What I discovered was this is, the thing that I use, this is a Gullah opera, and it's an American opera, and it is about those things. And I know that because my grandmother was Gullah. Okay? So I went to my grandmother's thing to do that show, and then you understand what it's about. Now, Susan Laurie Parks, a wonderful writer, I think, and all that stuff, but that's where you have to go. And then the other thing, as a scholar, you don't, if you rewrite an opera, you have to get somebody to rewrite the libretto, you have to get a composer. The whole notion of opera, created by the Florentines in the 16th century, is drama as music. It's not lines, it's not a play. Porgy and Bess is not that.
Yeah, it's
so
music first.
It's music. Well, you have to do it, you have to tell the story through the music. Porgy and Bess may have a little recitative here or there, but it's, and that's what opera is. So I have no idea, you know, what these folks are doing, and what makes me even more upset about that, if you have, can't we have a story about opera about a black woman that's not George Gershwin's? I mean, why are we doing George Gershwin? How much black music do we have? We got all kind of genres of black music. So can't, and a writer on her level, you mean we can't get a new opera? We got to go back and do this man's opera? What? Why? And we have to rewrite it because if we don't like that, don't rewrite it. Write the black character. She's a black woman writer. Write the character you like. Get a librettist. Get a composer. We got all these black musicians, people out of work. George Gershwin, oh, somebody needs to help him get his opera done again. I mean, is that really true? There's a production of Porgy and Bess, not just the ones we know about, but they've got them going on in Europe and every place.
Before Ren asks this,
we got to get. Okay.
And I have one for you. You know, before he passed away, I had the opportunity to talk to probably one of, as far as me, his voice is right up there with James Earl Jones, Ren Brown, those distinctive voices that you, and I'm being serious, we all know your voice.
Thank you.
And he was a professor of drama, theater, at Valley State, which is Cal State Northridge, and that's William Marshall. And, you know, most people know him as Dr. Daystrom on Star Trek, but more importantly as Blackula. Coming at it from an educational point of view, what can we do? Because he was very frustrated. And we had talks at the time. I was on the board for West Coast Ensemble, and what can we do to increase, even though it's a narrow field, but to increase the numbers from an educational point of view, to get more opportunities for African Americans and other minorities to learn the craft, the art. Your presentation went back a millennium. Not many people get that. I dare say probably less than maybe what, 2-3%?
Yeah. No, man, that's high. That's high.
But you know, every now and then you by circumstance and chance.
Right.
Some things come up, maybe doing Black History. So what can we do besides the programs, like I said, NAACP and AXA? They may not go further, but at least the education of African American theater. You yourself in your presentation, 2 books. You know, What can we do? How can we?
I mean, the question is, what can we do to get people involved, to get more people involved? Is that?
No, not that.
Okay.
To answer that, what can we do to increase the educational opportunities about African American theater?
I always feel, I mean, you know, when I work, it's a lot like the education is a lot like the theater. My wife is sitting back there, and she's a retired principal and teaches at her alma mater, Hunter College, and teaches master's degrees. Teachers. Education is a lot like the theater to me. There is an institute, the controlling institutions. If we can lobby with these people who control these institutions, who set curricula, who decide which shows are going to be done and what kind of stuff. I mean, it seems to me that that's what can be done for us inside, for those of us inside of the university, if that's what you're talking about. But my feeling about artists, and also I guess about people who want to study this, it's like a calling. See, that's what I was saying, that I do not really feel, and you don't need a whole lot of people. What I mean is, it's like a calling, and you have to be interested. You're not nobody who a person that's not interested. Well, they don't care about what's going to happen. Those passing rates talking about something 5,000 years ago. What is that? I mean, you have to be motivated from within. It's not like I'm going to decide to be an accountant for the student. It's a different thing. There's a calling involved. And we need to service those people, and that's what my first thing. And if you do that, then the people that you want will come to find you. Because this has got to be a calling. People, Arthur French was one wonderful actor, and we always said, you know, Henry, you crazy, I'm crazy. This is not normal. People don't do this. Not in this capitalistic world that we're living in. Okay? You have to be driven. You have to be called. You have to decide. I think I decided at 14, all this other stuff is not really that important. This is important to me. I think, you know, if I live for another so many years and then I'm gone, I will have left something. And so far, it's pretty much worked out that way. But that's what I wanted. Yes.
I think that I hear you. And somewhere in some city, there's someone who does have that desire, but they don't even know
where.
Exactly.
How to, you know, and maybe if you have the right parents and you have the right community, then something brushes past you in your life and you say, oh, that's it. But somewhere there's a kid who might not get that brush.
Yeah.
And in there's the potential, or they hear a calling of something, but they're not really sure how to do it.
Right.
I would say, just in kind of practical terms, that PowerPoint is amazing.
Yes.
I mean, I think we've been to our share of presentations, and that, and I think your background probably.
Yeah, I went to film school. I'm guilty.
That wasn't really so I would say, just something really practical is there are ways to convert a PowerPoint into a video.
Oh yeah, I guess there are. Yeah.
And that PowerPoint alone, with all the keywords.
Yeah.
Everything that was in there, a keyword, so that if somebody's out there searching, because that's how we search now. Right. Now that's how we search, right? So that kid who's in whatever neighborhood they're in, if they're looking for something, if they're looking up Shakespeare, we need to make sure they get to you. We need to get to this information. So I would say that's one way. Is to make sure that there's an introduction or a representation in digital space, so that someone's looking, they can find and then go further.
Especially in this country, because, and once again, I just give you a personal example. We moved from the city to a very small town in Virginia. Okay? So not everyone has access to the city resources. I mean, I know growing up in New York, my parents, they didn't go to college. They didn't know all this fancy stuff you're talking about. But I do remember that there were 2 nights that my grandparents babysat us, and they went to go see Don't Drink the Water, don't do something when the water's running.
Okay, right.
70s.
I think that's a Robert Redford movie, if I remember correctly.
It was a play.
Right, and it was a play. I think he.
And and they didn't always go to Broadway. I mean, they didn't go that often.
Right.
It's off Broadway, as you know, and off Broadway were probably the better works of. But Andretta is right. There needs to be something in this day and age where if I'm in Podunk, Iowa, you know, I can search because I'm driven to search and see this presentation. One of our faculty members here is combating obesity the same way. She did Dr. Antoinette Yancey. She did a DVD, and by her work on obesity and saying you can do 10 minutes of exercise even at work, Michelle Obama put on her committee because she saw that.
Wow.
Okay? So that's what I'm saying. The digital age, we need to do that for those people who are on Facebook, who are on all these other things, but they live in a town of 500, which they may be one of 10 people who might be of color. And they're not going to be able to just jump into little theater for that town.
So powerful. When I had no idea of the illiterati.
Yeah.
Oh, that I knew nothing about that in your presentation. But those, just the influence that those people have had on our world, just from having the access to that. I mean, I think that's an example, right? So the person who's in whatever city, who does have that calling, I think their potential is huge.
You know, also, I think that it really is hugely important that we celebrate self and that we really recognize the miraculous nature of the fact that black people are still existing. We are a truly triumphant people. Though we've been greatly victimized, we are not victims, but we have to continue to tell our stories. And really, it's about, my grandfather used to use the phrase that amateurs get trophies and pros get paid. You really, finally, you have to become a professional. You really have to work hard, and that's what Doc was talking about with regard to a calling. You have to work hard. You know, there's a wonderful scripture in the Bible that says, it's Ephesians 4:1, I therefore, servant of the Lord, beseech ye that ye walk worthy of the chosen vocation wherewith ye were called. And that's out of a Christian dynamic, but at the end of the day, it's about a calling. It's really about pursuing this thing. You talked about Alex William Marshall. Now, has anyone ever heard of the term the Negro voice? The Negro voice was really something that was in radio. And William Marshall, and he happened to be from Indiana, like James Edwards, who was in Home of the Brave, preceding Mr. Sidney Poitier in 1949. These are people who had the Negro voice.
The Negro voice,
and you had it in such a way, and James Earl Jones is out of this tradition as well. And it identified. It was dark, it was brooding, and it you know, said, and that's a Negro, that's a spoof. That's all of those pejorative terms that used to come, you know, because the Negro was different than someone who was colored. And so we have to understand that, but if we are so into a microwave civilization, and black people at our finest, we were always a crock pot people, where all of the nuances, all of this, the ingredients and the spices could come together and get in that carrot and get in that broccoli and get in that meat. It would seep in. And so if we get back to the crock pot dynamic from our community, I think we're better served, because we're going to forget. I mean, frankly, Dr. Du Bois is almost forgotten. Booker T. Washington is almost forgotten.
Oh, wow.
But Doc, I wanted to ask you a question for the record. In the book, you deal with Harold Cruse and the notion of historical discontinuity.
Yeah.
Would you speak on that for a moment, please?
My issue about, we have always had a very powerful black tradition, I mean, historically speaking, right? But one of the things that I think the scholars haven't given attention to are the great effects of the things like the Depression, the Second World War, and Harold Cruse is really the one who points this out. So there is a kind of historical discontinuity. The people of my generation knew nothing about the people of the Harlem Renaissance that this young man was talking about. Because what came between us and the Harlem Renaissance? Well, it was the Depression, the Second World War. These things kind of wiped out our knowledge, so the tradition was not handed down. And I guess in a sense, this is what the book is trying to do, because the whole my whole feeling is that people that don't have a past don't really have a future. And we kind of have been wandering around in the wilderness. But that's because, and it's not because there's something particularly different or wrong or not as good about black people. These major events, the Depression, World War II, the Civil Rights Movement. As I said, I'm part of that. I'm a victim of that, or whatever we want to call it. We were concerned with getting whitey straight and telling the truth and doing a fundamentally protest. Although what we talked about, the whole idea of protest drama, it goes back to the beginning of the 20th century by a bunch of women writers mostly. But we didn't know anything about that. We didn't know that Du Bois, who we talk about. Our great quote from Du Bois in the 1960s was that all art is propaganda. And Du Bois did say that. He said that in 1926. But in 1930, he said all art is propaganda, but all propaganda is not art. We didn't get that in the night. We did all art is propaganda. Okay? So it's not, so the idea, if you want to move to a black aesthetic and a kind of solid theater and a real kind of theater like Wynn is talking about, you got to go back and do it. The cosmos is very unforgiving. You either do the work or you don't. So again, what Wynn was saying, so Cruz talked about, and it opened me up. And Cruz is of the 40s. Cruz is of the, I think he was in a theater company in New York in the 1940s, in a little theater company. So he talked about this whole thing of historical discontinuity. Yes.
Yeah, when I was watching the beginning of your slideshow, you started talking about drama as it was used in Egypt, and then you went through the Greeks and the Roman times. And for another course of mine, I read Black Folks Here and There, and I'm forgetting his name. But what he tried to do is to take back the ancient history of African peoples to say, this is what we have contributed, and this is the connection between racism as we experience it today and the way that people understood race and things like this in the ancient times. But when I was looking at your slideshow, I was wondering how you would connect a dramatic tradition that comes from Africa with the type of modes of communication that we have today that's not necessarily linear or connected.
Well, I think the modes of communication we have today aren't necessarily linear. The book is entitled Theorizing Black Drama, so a lot is about theory, and theory has to do with philosophies. So the notion of, this is why, as I was saying, Alain Locke, he's a philosopher. It's how you, and philosophy and theory, to me, we can have this be an esoteric thing that we kind of don't understand. There's a bunch of old men out at the edge of the cosmos making quotes and stuff. We can look at it that way. Or we can look at it, it's what people think their world is about and how they conduct themselves. That's how I think about theory. It's not so that I can discuss it with you or anybody. You don't have to be a philosopher. So the idea in going back to the Abydos Passion Plays, first thing you have, the first hero is not a man. It's ISIS. That's the first hero of that drama. So already the gender issues that are prevalent today that we're struggling back and forth with, there it is. And it's 4,000 years ago, okay? You see what I'm saying? So, and even the way we have this discussion, you were saying, well, back then, because we think, we have been programmed to think linearly. We talk about back then and back forward. One of the reasons that when Ren asked me to do this, I titled this program, Back to the Future, because the African concept is the notion, and to some extent the Eastern, is the circle. You see what I'm saying? So you don't go, it's not this linear thing, and we get that out of our linear thinking comes from the idea that we're born, we live, we die. Because that's the way we understand the world. We're born, we live, we die. Actually, we know now, even from the hard scientists, is that time is relative. You cannot, we've launched missiles and all that stuff. You can't do it with Euclidean geometry. What do you have to do? Circle. The cosmos a circle. So see, these people thousands of years ago who were primitive and savages, they were right. So it's that kind of thinking about the drama. In that, sorry I clicked that off and it'll take too much time for me to find it, but in that particular frieze, there is Isis, Horus, and Horus is a grown man, but what is happening is his conception. And when I said that he's lying ithyphallic, Osiris is lying ithyphallic, that's a nice word for saying that he had an erection. And the hawk that's on top of his erection is the symbol of Isis. So a grown man participating in his own conception, this is the circle. It's not, I'm born, I live, I die, and that's the end. There are no ends. When when we doing all this stuff out in the cosmos now, this is what we're discovering. We can't find any ends. There's no beginning and no end. So that kind of, those philosophies, in fact, I mean, they've come back to, if you study deeply and you get into this stuff, they've come back to us. It's not something that happened a long time ago, it's happening right now. Even, what's her name with her little protest play? This thing about, women's rights and the body, such as 1917, these women are carrying on about this. So, well, this is not, I get bent out of shape about this because we talk about stuff. Well, you said something about the president. Well, he came into office and there was almost a depression, all that. That's like, that didn't happen. When I look at the news, we don't talk about that. But all of this stuff is now. When you look at it that way, in other words, when you're not looking at it linear, what is it? The past is prologue. That quote. That's the African, in some way, ancient African way of thinking about it. So now you have to do the drama that way. A lot of my plays have prologues and epilogues because the beginning is the end. And even when they don't, the end somehow comes back to the beginning. I hope I answered that question.
Wrap it up.
Okay.
Thank you. Very enlightening.
Thank you.
But, I do